In the bustling streets of a small town, a stray dog named Buddy became a local legend for his peculiar habit. Every day, without fail, Buddy would trot up to Mr. Jenkins's corner shop, gently holding a single, crisp leaf in his mouth. The townspeople watched in amusement as he presented it to Mr. Jenkins, wagging his tail expectantly. Mr. Jenkins, always too busy to pay much mind, would shoo Buddy away, puzzled by the dog's actions but never giving it much thought. It wasn't until a chance conversation with a customer that Mr. Jenkins discovered the heartwarming reason behind Buddy's daily offerings. One day, when Buddy entered Mr. Jenkins's shop, a customer who was just at the checkout paying for his groceries laughed at the sight of the dog carrying a leaf in its mouth. He mumbled something and then turned back to Mr. Jenkins to pay, but the shop owner was staring at him with wide eyes. "What did you just say?" he asked the customer. The customer replied that he had heard this dog visited other shops in the neighborhood as well, and people were saying it was trying to trade the leaf for some food. Sadly, none of the shop owners ever gave it anything to eat since business wasn't going well lately, and the dog always left hungry. This got Mr. Jenkins thinking, and he decided to learn more about this dog. Up until now, he hadn't really thought anything at all about it, but now he was determined to find out its story. And by doing so, he would discover a shocking truth. Why was Buddy bringing a leaf to shops in town? What did he want? And where did he come from? And what would Mr. Jenkins do upon discovering the truth? Mr. Jenkins had already shooed Buddy away when the customer told him all of this, and he kind of regretted it. He realized that he had been so caught up in his work that he never really thought about what this poor dog wanted. He assumed that it was indeed hungry and looking for some food, as the customer had said. But soon he would find out what was really going on. After the customer paid and left the shop, Mr. Jenkins found himself in front of the shelves with animal food. He picked out some cans of dog food and a couple of cookies and placed them behind the counter. When Buddy came tomorrow, he would give him some food. He felt quite guilty for not having thought of this before, but better late than never, he told himself. The next day, Mr. Jenkins opened his shop and greeted all the customers with his usual happy smiles and loud hellos. It was a very busy day, and he had kind of forgotten about Buddy in all the chaos. However, his ears immediately pointed when he heard someone say, "Ah, there he is again. Hi, Buddy." Mr. Jenkins glanced at the entrance door of his shop, and he was glad to see Buddy had returned. The dog slowly entered the shop, keeping its head down low, just above the ground. As usual, it was carrying a leaf. A little girl ran to it and petted it before her mom pulled her away and told her, "As soon as we get home, you'll wash those dirty hands." Some of Mr. Jenkins's usual customers happened to be in the shop, and they knew that he always shooed the dog away. So they gently whispered, "You better leave before the boss sees you, Buddy." This time, however, Mr. Jenkins's reaction surprised them. "No, that's okay. Let him in, please," he said with a big smile. The customers hadn't expected this, and they moved out of Buddy's way to let him enter the shop further. Mr. Jenkins had been standing behind the counter, but he had made his way to Buddy. As soon as the dog saw him, it stopped and turned around. It was used to Mr. Jenkins sending it away whenever he approached it. This time, his intentions were different though. As soon as Mr. Jenkins saw the dog was turning to leave, he came to a halt and crouched down as he placed the food he had picked out the day before on the floor. "Here you go, Buddy. You must be hungry," he said with a gentle voice, very different from the way he usually spoke to the dog, and he stepped back. Buddy approached the food cautiously at first, but then he leaned down and sniffed it. Realizing it was safe, he began to eat, his tail wagging slightly as he gulped down the food. The shop's customers, now gathering around, watched Buddy eat with warm smiles. Mr. Jenkins stayed back, hands on his hips, nodding with approval as the stray dog finished his meal. After Buddy had licked the floor clean, he sat back on his haunches and looked around, wondering what came next. Mr. Jenkins approached slowly, crouched down, and extended his hand. Buddy sniffed it cautiously, then allowed Mr. Jenkins to gently stroke his fur. "Good boy, Buddy," Mr. Jenkins murmured, giving him a scratch behind the ears. The dog's tail began to wag again. Satisfied and with a final pat from Mr. Jenkins, Buddy turned to leave the shop. He glanced back once before padding toward the door. His tail wagged happily as he walked out, looking back once more before heading down the street. The customers smiled at the sight, and Mr. Jenkins waved him goodbye, feeling content. Mr. Jenkins remained at the doorway, his gaze following Buddy as he trotted away down the street. He couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. His usual customers were still buzzing with the unexpected change in his attitude toward the dog. He hoped Buddy would be okay, and that whatever he was up to, it was safe and kind. Even after he had waved Buddy off, Mr. Jenkins couldn't shake the thought of where Buddy might be going. The dog came by the shop every day, but no one knew where he went after leaving. He hoped to figure out Buddy's destination someday. He stepped back into the shop, wiped his hands on his apron, and greeted the next customer. The following morning, Buddy trotted back into the shop, carrying a new leaf. Mr. Jenkins was ready for him, crouching down and offering him another meal. Buddy ate gratefully as a couple of customers watched with fond smiles. Mr. Jenkins gave Buddy a pat on the head, and Buddy wagged his tail in appreciation before once again leaving the shop. Buddy's visits became a regular occurrence, like clockwork, every morning at opening time. Mr. Jenkins always had food ready for him, and the customers grew used to seeing Buddy around the shop. Some of them even chipped in with extra snacks for the dog. Buddy seemed to enjoy the daily attention, wagging his tail as he received pats from the friendly customers. As the days went by, Mr. Jenkins found himself looking forward to Buddy's visits. He made it a point to have fresh food set aside for the dog each day. Every time Buddy entered the shop, Mr. Jenkins would smile and greet him warmly. The customers also seemed to enjoy Buddy's company, often gathering around to watch him eat with cheerful grins. People in the neighborhood began to notice Buddy's improved appearance. His coat started to shine, and he seemed to be putting on weight. Passers-by commented on how good he looked and even stopped by the shop to share the good news. Mr. Jenkins felt a growing sense of pride, glad to see that his efforts were helping the little dog thrive. One evening, as Mr. Jenkins was closing up, he noticed Buddy sitting quietly by the door, patiently waiting for him. It was unusual to see Buddy at that time of day. He stood up, locked the door, and looked down at Buddy, who gazed back with eager eyes. His tail wagged with anticipation as he stood by the shop's entrance, ready to show him something. Mr. Jenkins tilted his head in curiosity, intrigued by Buddy's sudden sense of urgency, and nodded, deciding to follow him. Mr. Jenkins quickly secured the shop, double-checking that the door was firmly locked. He glanced back at Buddy, who watched him patiently. With the shop secure, Mr. Jenkins turned toward Buddy, intrigued by what the dog had in mind. He had never seen the dog so focused before, and his curiosity to find out what was going on grew stronger. As soon as Mr. Jenkins stepped away from the shop, Buddy started walking. The dog moved steadily, occasionally pausing to ensure that Mr. Jenkins was following. He'd turn to glance back, then continue forward. Mr. Jenkins followed, his footsteps echoing off the quiet street. Buddy seemed to know exactly where he was going, moving with purpose through the town. Curiosity piqued, Mr. Jenkins kept up with Buddy's brisk pace, determined to find out where the dog was heading. He hadn't planned on a late-night adventure, but Buddy's urgency drove him to follow along. They passed several houses and a quiet park and ventured toward the edge of town. The dog led the way with unwavering determination, ears perked forward. Buddy led Mr. Jenkins to the edge of the nearby forest. The sun had almost set, and the woods looked darker and more imposing than usual. Hesitantly, Mr. Jenkins glanced around before stepping forward, following Buddy into the dense trees. The dog kept moving ahead, barely slowing down to navigate the path. Mr. Jenkins, however, found himself treading carefully. As Mr. Jenkins ventured deeper into the forest with Buddy, the path became narrower and the trees taller. The canopy above blocked the remaining light, making the surroundings darker. Branches tangled overhead and undergrowth thickened along the trail. Mr. Jenkins navigated carefully, his footsteps echoing softly on the path. Buddy moved ahead confidently, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Buddy trotted through the forest with ease, his ears perking as he listened for familiar sounds. The path twisted and turned, but Buddy never wavered. Mr. Jenkins tried to keep pace, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. He marveled at the dog's sense of direction, impressed by how confidently Buddy led the way deeper into the woods. With each step deeper into the forest, Mr. Jenkins grew more intrigued. He wondered why Buddy was leading him so far into the woods. What was this dog trying to show him? The air was cooler and shadows grew longer as they went further. Despite his curiosity, Mr. Jenkins felt an inkling of unease creeping up, but he kept moving. The forest felt vast and eerie, and Mr. Jenkins began to doubt his decision to follow a stray dog. He paused briefly, watching Buddy disappear further into the darkness. The dog's unwavering determination, however, spurred him to continue. Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath and pressed on, hoping his trust in Buddy would be rewarded as they ventured further. Buddy suddenly whined and began moving faster, weaving through the trees with renewed urgency. His ears perked forward as he darted ahead, his path almost invisible to Mr. Jenkins in the dim light. The stray's paws crunched on the dry leaves, the sound echoing through the silent forest. Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath and hurried his pace to keep up. Mr. Jenkins hurried along, trying to match Buddy's pace. He pushed through bushes and leapt over roots, determined not to lose sight of the dog. The forest felt darker and more oppressive with each step, but he kept going, his eyes fixed on Buddy's tail, which was just visible through the underbrush. He had no idea what awaited them. The forest seemed to stretch on forever as Mr. Jenkins and Buddy pressed deeper into it. The sounds of the town faded away, leaving only the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Mr. Jenkins felt a sense of urgency in Buddy's swift movements and trusted the dog's instincts. His footsteps quickened as he moved further, determined to find out where Buddy was leading him. As they continued deeper into the forest, the town's faint sounds vanished completely. Only the occasional rustling of leaves and their footsteps broke the silence. Mr. Jenkins felt a chill, but he followed Buddy's unwavering path. The further they went, the more curious he became about what could be driving the dog through the forest so late at night. In the dim forest, Mr. Jenkins suddenly lost sight of Buddy. He stopped, glancing around, his eyes straining to spot the dog in the shadows. He listened intently, hearing only the gentle breeze and rustling leaves. Feeling a twinge of worry, he waited, turning in place to scan the forest for any sign of movement, hoping to spot Buddy again. Mr. Jenkins paused to listen, straining to hear any familiar sounds. Faint barking and whining pierced the forest's silence, guiding him toward an old shed nestled among the trees. He followed the noise through the underbrush, carefully maneuvering around the tangled foliage. The barks grew louder as he approached the shed, its weathered wooden walls standing out in the dark forest. The shed looked dilapidated, with missing shingles and weathered planks. The door hung slightly ajar, its rusty hinges barely holding it in place. Mr. Jenkins stood a few feet away, noticing the overgrown vegetation around the structure. The barking persisted, coming from inside. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and cautiously stepped closer, uncertain of what he would find. Mr. Jenkins approached the shed with slow, measured steps, his eyes focused on the darkened doorway. The barking was louder now, echoing through the woods and stirring up nervous anticipation. He carefully sidestepped broken branches and stones, nearing the door with a tentative hand. He glanced over his shoulder before stepping up to the door, listening closely to the sounds within. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Jenkins gently pushed the door open. It creaked on its rusty hinges, and the faint moonlight revealed a dark interior. He peered inside, straining to see what lay beyond the threshold. The barking continued, echoing off the shed's walls. He stepped forward, his flashlight illuminating the cluttered space, searching for Buddy among the shadows. Inside the shed, Mr. Jenkins took a moment to let his eyes adjust to the darkness. He was surrounded by shadowy shapes, remnants of old equipment and broken furniture. His flashlight flickered over the rough wooden walls as he scanned the room, listening for Buddy. The dog's barking had ceased, leaving an eerie silence in the dimly lit shed. The interior was cluttered, with shadows obscuring the corners. Piles of old tools, broken furniture and forgotten supplies were stacked haphazardly around the shed. Mr. Jenkins could see faint outlines of objects through the dim light. He moved the flashlight slowly across the space, trying to make sense of the chaos around him. His ears strained to pick up any more sounds of Buddy. Mr. Jenkins stepped further into the shed, the floorboards creaking loudly under his weight. He winced, hoping he wouldn't startle Buddy, and proceeded more cautiously. The boards groaned as he moved, his steps echoing in the confined space. He advanced carefully, making his way through the maze of clutter, his flashlight illuminating the narrow path ahead of him. Dust swirled in the air as Mr. Jenkins moved through the shed, his footsteps stirring up particles that had been settled for years. He coughed softly, his breath catching on the stale and musty air. The flashlight cast a narrow beam of light that cut through the darkness, revealing cobwebs hanging from the rafters and dust motes drifting lazily in the light. Buddy's bark echoed off the walls, guiding Mr. Jenkins further into the shed. He followed the sound, weaving around piles of discarded objects. The dog's voice grew louder, encouraging him to keep moving forward. Mr. Jenkins stepped cautiously, trying not to trip on the scattered debris. His flashlight bounced over the disorganized interior as he searched for the source of the barking. The shed was dark, with only Mr. Jenkins's flashlight cutting through the shadows. He struggled to see clearly, the beam barely reaching the corners. He paused briefly, scanning the room for Buddy. He could hear faint rustling in the darkness and moved toward it, his hand tightening on the flashlight. He stepped carefully around the clutter, determined to find Buddy. As Mr. Jenkins's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed movement in the far corner of the shed. He squinted, trying to make out what was there. His flashlight revealed a faint outline of Buddy's tail, wagging steadily. He carefully stepped toward the dog, his heart racing as he got closer, eager to see what had captured Buddy's attention. Buddy was scratching at something hidden under old tarps, his nose sniffing frantically at the fabric. The dog whimpered softly, pawing at the layers of tarp covering the mystery beneath. Mr. Jenkins stepped closer, trying to get a better look at what the dog had uncovered. The tarps were dusty and tattered, piled in disarray in the corner of the shed. Mr. Jenkins approached, his curiosity overcoming his initial hesitation. He crouched down beside Buddy, patting the dog gently before grabbing the edge of the tarp. He hesitated briefly, but the urgency in Buddy's movements pushed him to act. Gripping the tarp firmly, he pulled it back with a swift motion, his breath catching as he uncovered the reason Buddy had led him here. Mr. Jenkins pulled back the tarp, revealing the reason Buddy had led him here. The sight before him took him by surprise. He stared for a moment, taking in the scene as Buddy whined softly beside him. He glanced back at the dog, feeling a mix of emotions, before quickly turning to address the matter at hand. Shocked by his discovery, Mr. Jenkins hurriedly called the police. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number. Buddy stayed by his side, wagging his tail slightly as Mr. Jenkins relayed what he had found to the dispatcher. After hanging up, he took a deep breath, knowing he needed to act quickly to secure the scene. Mr. Jenkins then ran back to his shop, planning his next steps. He raced through the woods, his breath quick and shallow. He fumbled with the key as he reached the shop, quickly unlocking the door. Once inside, he paused to gather his thoughts, deciding on what he needed to take with him back to the shed to handle the situation. Grabbing a bag, Mr. Jenkins filled it with supplies he thought necessary. He grabbed food, water bottles, and a blanket, stuffing them all in the bag. He quickly checked the shop once more, ensuring he had everything he needed. Satisfied, he slung the bag over his shoulder and locked up, ready to return to the shed and help Buddy. Returning to the forest, Mr. Jenkins made his way back to the shed. He followed the path he had taken earlier, guided by his flashlight's narrow beam. He moved quickly, his heart racing, focused on the journey back. The forest seemed even darker this time, but he pushed forward, driven by the urgency of the task at hand. It took time, but Mr. Jenkins found the shed again. He approached it cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the weathered walls. The shed was quiet, and Mr. Jenkins hesitated at the door, remembering what awaited inside. He took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the flashlight, and pushed the door open, stepping back into the darkness to find Buddy. Buddy was waiting, as if he knew Mr. Jenkins would return. The dog sat by the corner, his ears perking up as the shopkeeper stepped inside. Mr. Jenkins approached slowly, setting the bag down and pulling out the supplies. He gave Buddy a pat on the head, grateful for the dog's patience, before starting to lay out the items he had brought. Mr. Jenkins laid out a blanket, dog food, a bowl, and water. He worked quickly, spreading the blanket on the dusty floor of the shed. He filled the bowl with water and opened a can of dog food, placing it beside Buddy. The dog eagerly approached the food, sniffing it before digging in. Mr. Jenkins nodded, satisfied with his preparations. Mr. Jenkins comforted Buddy, who seemed relieved by his return. He knelt beside the dog, gently scratching behind his ears. Buddy's tail wagged slowly, his eyes fixed on Mr. Jenkins. The shopkeeper smiled softly, giving Buddy a reassuring pat. He knew the dog had been waiting patiently for help, and his loyalty had brought Mr. Jenkins to this moment. Buddy had led Mr. Jenkins to a litter of abandoned puppies. The tiny creatures lay nestled in the corner, their soft whimpers echoing through the shed. Mr. Jenkins's heart ached at the sight. He moved closer, gently touching each puppy to ensure they were okay. Their eyes barely opened. They squirmed in response to his touch, huddling together for warmth. He wrapped the puppies in a blanket, providing warmth. Mr. Jenkins carefully scooped them up and arranged them on the soft fabric. He covered them gently, ensuring they were snug and safe. Buddy stayed close, his eyes watching Mr. Jenkins's every move. The puppies settled into the blanket, their tiny forms huddled together in the comfort of the warmth. He then gave the puppies water and food, ensuring their comfort. Mr. Jenkins placed small bowls near them, filling one with water and the other with puppy food. He used his hands to carefully feed the pups, their tiny tongues lapping at the water eagerly. He wiped their mouths with the edge of the blanket, making sure they were clean and fed. Soon, animal control arrived, called by the police to assist. 2 officers carefully approached the shed, carrying crates and other equipment. Mr. Jenkins greeted them, explaining the situation while Buddy watched from a distance. The officers listened attentively, nodding before stepping inside to assess the puppies. They inspected the litter gently, noting their condition before preparing to transport them to safety. They assessed the situation, preparing to take the puppies to safety. The officers laid out soft towels in the crates, ready to carry the puppies to a safer environment. They gently transferred the puppies from the blanket into the crates, handling them with care. Mr. Jenkins stood back, watching them work, hoping for the best as the officers finished securing the puppies. Mr. Jenkins adopted one of the rescued puppies, forming a bond. At the shelter, he chose a little pup with bright eyes and a playful spirit. After filling out the paperwork, he took the puppy home. He spent days helping the puppy adjust, ensuring it was comfortable in its new surroundings. Soon, the puppy settled into its new life, finding joy in Mr. Jenkins's care. He found loving homes for the other puppies, ensuring their care. He reached out to friends and family, sharing the puppy's story. One by one, the puppies found new homes, each welcomed into families eager to provide care. Mr. Jenkins made sure the adopters understood the puppies' needs and followed up to ensure their continued well-being, delighted with each success. Buddy continued to roam free, still visiting the shops. He became a familiar sight around town, carrying his leaf from one shop to another. The community grew fond of Buddy, and many residents took turns leaving food and water for him. Mr. Jenkins always welcomed Buddy into his shop, grateful for the dog's presence and the story that had brought them together.